So I should technically be in Hinton right now. By my schedule, which is ridiculously planned out a year in advance, I should be in front of a grade 8 class in Hinton telling dad jokes right now and talking about the sacraments.
How does it feel to go from 100 to absolute 0, stopping and just...
It's kind of surreal. I mean, you kind of knew this was all coming. I mean, you kind of telegraph what was going on as different things go on, you know, and then you get to the point where they shut down the NHL season right when the Oilers are going to make the playoffs. But you can sort of see
the 1 year, actually, yeah, the 1 year. It's gracious. But yeah,
Connor McDavid's superhuman healing, but you kind of go through all this stuff. You kind of see it coming, and then on Sunday afternoon, like, we got an email from our assistant superintendent saying, these are the measures we're going to enact this week with students. We're canceling flex blocks. We're adjusting various things, you know, and hours later, nope, we're canceling classes. And it was really a fascinating thing to be sitting in a staff meeting on Monday morning saying, now what? And watching my colleagues kind of put their heads down and say, here's how we're going to help kids graduate and do well moving forward. And I mean, it's probably true of every school in every place that's been shut down like this. How do we learn a new skill? How do we teach remotely? But it really, I think it's surreal. How are you doing?
You know what? I'll share this story actually. So on Sunday, after doing the first 2 masses in Vashon, Castor, and having to make the restrictions that were put in place, the directives from the Archbishop, known to the people, I was finishing up my last mass in Stettler, and one of the precautions we took just ahead of time was to not have the hosts being brought up during, or rather, we didn't have the hosts put out at the entrances for people to put in their individual ones, and there was a little bit of a mess up. But I think and don't get me wrong, I'm not hopefully too superstitious in this way, but it felt like an omen where I had the altar set out and only my host was present there, and I turned to my servers, bring out the extra hosts because I need to give it to the people. And everyone was scrambling during that moment, and it took a while before they were delivered, but it was, I think, almost sort of that forewarning for me that there are things to come. And with Monday and the new restrictions put on, having no one except for the priest at Mass, it seemed fitting in that way. Foreboding, but still fitting. You know, I think the best way I can describe it is I feel conflicted. There have been so many things happening in the last 72 hours that I've needed to take some time just to sit down and process what's been going on, because it does feel like a dream. It feels like I've had too much rotten cheese and gone to bed, and I can't wake up. For the life of me, I can't get out of this dream. It doesn't feel real at all.
I was really young when the original Gulf War went down, but I do remember just the way that it dominated everything. Like, this was, you know, everything kind of stopped for a few days when the U.S. went and bombed Iraq, and everything sort of unfolded from there. But I remember a lot more vividly when the terrorist attacks happened on the World Trade Center, in the various places in the States on 9/11, and it was the same sort of a feeling, like, is this even real? And I think, you know, the moment, at least from fiction, that I've been thinking of a lot this week has been that scene in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Gandalf are sitting together, and Frodo says, you know, I wish this had never happened. I wish the ring had never come to me. But Gandalf looks at Frodo and says, so do all who come to such times. And he talks about how you have to choose what to do at the time, but then he says something else that has really stuck with me. He said, there are forces other than that of evil at work in the world.
I would agree. One thing that I've noticed a lot on social media and in conversation is on the question of fear. And I'm seeing a lot of these gurus and motivational speakers trying to sort of placate people by saying, don't fear, don't fear, don't fear. And here I'm going to say something very controversial. No. Fear. It is right and just at the moment to have some fear, to experience that emotion. And that's where I want to begin. You know, it's only in being able to recognize that we can actually move forward. It's recognizing that fear is an emotion, is one of the emotions that are base emotions. It is an underlying aspect of everyone's personality. It's a biological fact that we have this emotion in us to save our lives. In fact, I would dare say that fear is a gift from God, because evolutionarily speaking, if we were in the savannah and we heard the rustling of a lion, if we lacked that emotion, that emotional response of fear to flee, I'm sorry, but we can't fight a lion. It saves our lives. I mean, unless you're Mike, of course, then take on that lion. But it'd
be a glorious ending.
It would be a noble ending, absolutely glorious. But that is the one thing that allows us to prepare and to live. Now, as all things, Aristotle is always the person to turn to when we're talking about human personality, as I think he's a master in this. Aristotle says all things in moderation. Even this emotional response needs to be in moderation. We can't be over fearful and start panicking and enter into a sense of paranoia, thinking that danger is around us at all times, nor... Yes?
You mean like the toilet paper shortage?
Like the toilet paper shortage, for sure. But at the same time, we can't do the opposite, which is to disrespect this fear and this occasion and not to take things seriously, as some TikTokers are doing the coronavirus challenge, as I've heard. Whether that is real or not, people are talking about it, but that's the thing. What is the moderate and well-balanced thing to do in this time?
We often, one of my school counselors that I work with, a man that I respect a lot, he often talks about the dangers of recklessness. You know, and he kind of counters that towards, remember, you got to remember Dead Poet Society.
Yes.
You know, oh, Captain, my Captain, seize the day, and all the different things that kind of went with that. But there's this sense that Robin Williams' character is trying to elicit courage from his students, to get them to stand up, to try something, to be something. But there's a difference between what he's trying to get out of them and this sense of recklessness, which would be me going to fight the lion. Right? The lion should know better. That's a reckless thing to take me on. But you have this sense of recklessness where we don't consider the consequences, sometimes for ourselves, sometimes for others. You know, what's the impact? If I become seriously ill, that has an effect on my children, on my wife, on others in my circle, in my community. And I think what we're being asked to do is not to be fearful, to have a healthy fear of something. Right? When I speak of fear with students, I borrow from the late great Father Mike Moreau, who used to talk about fear is the great enemy. Fear is the opposite of love. And I don't think he's talking about fear in the same way as you are. But Pope Benedict XVI, gosh, it's got to be about 15 years ago, was in Brazil talking to young people. He talked about 3 layers of fear that were dangerous. He talked about, you know, the fear of being alone, the fear of failure, and the fear of death. And when we let those control our lives, well, then that's when we start running to the toilet paper stores and running to grocery stores and buying out all the toilet paper. And I'm hearing stories of people who own businesses where people are like taking the toilet paper from work and emptying the sanitizer bottles into it. You know, this is a panic fear. And I think that's the fear that becomes the enemy for us. And it's where is
the moderate
where is
response?
God?
Where is God?
Where is God? I don't think God's in either one of these extremes where you don't fear anything and so you don't care, but also where you let the fear paralyze you or lets you do something stupid. that harms yourself or others.
Ironically, Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think there is a great tie to that, because fear is almost a natural companion with the aspect of suffering, which I think already we as a society are feeling, and especially as a church that has been now severed from that living daily Mass, that living communion with the Eucharistic Lord. We are entering into a time of great suffering. But I think, as the ancient Greeks also knew, wisdom is only attained through suffering. There is potential in what we are going through and what we will be led into. And ultimately, I believe that is a greater sense of wisdom. Even just that sense of gratitude that we will one day have once more after all this blows over, of having stores still full of food and food in abundance. I think in many ways, this year's Thanksgiving that we will have in a number of months will be one that many have not experienced before, an actual Thanksgiving for the graces that we still have with us. You know, speaking again on this front of fear, it lays the groundwork for something greater as well. As you mentioned already, it lays the groundwork for courage and bravery. Without fear, without honest to goodness fear, if we have nothing to fear, there's nothing that leads or allows us to be brave or courageous. It is only in the presence of fear that we can actually reach those virtues. And I would dare say, during this time of crisis, that's what we are called, if not by God, then at least by others, to a sense of greater bravery and courage, and however that is expressed in an isolated world. It's difficult because we usually have those words, bravery and courage, tied to heroic acts during times of war, during times of other civil issues, fires, massive fires, firemen jumping into a building, saving someone. That's an act of courage. But how are we to be courageous and brave in a time of social distancing and isolation? That is a question I'm trying to figure out myself. But I know that it's only in trying to figure that out that I can actually be able to respond in the way I need to be responding, in a type of leadership that us as Christian leaders are now called to an extraordinary means. We have been thrust into this crucible, whether we were prepared or not, whether we were young or old, we are in it together. And now we have to act in ways that are heroic, brave, courageous, prudent, and wise.
Two images come to mind for me when I think about what we're sort of being dropped into. And one is my kids. I mean, I've been thinking about my kids a lot in all of this. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I haven't imagined like every end of the world movie I've ever seen before, from WALL-E to I Am Legend to Independence Day and everything else like that. But on a more realistic level, when my kids have a nightmare, you know, what they do, you know, they come upstairs or they come across the hallway, and generally speaking, they wake either myself or my wife up, and usually the end result is cuddling mommy. Like that's almost always where a small child who has a nightmare ends up, is in mom's arms. And I'm thinking about that a fair bit in the context of being cut off from the sacraments. Because the reality is for pretty well anybody watching this, for my family, for most of us, how are we going to get there? I mean, what's our we're being cut off from our Holy Mother, the Church, you know, and there's something kind of being put on your own for the first time, and you know, can we make our way through it? But It also makes me think of a second image, and I believe this comes from the Cherokee tribe, where their rite of passage for a boy becoming a man, they have him go outside, and he has to sit on a stump blindfolded overnight in the forest and not leave the stump. And he has to stay there until the sun gets high enough in the sky that the light shines through the blindfold, and at that point he can take it off. As somebody who's afraid of the dark, and I'm very afraid of the dark, like we have night lights in my house, and I say it's for my kids, but really it's for me. But as someone who's afraid of the dark, this would be the most terrifying thing, because you'd have all these real sounds and all the imagined ones that you think you hear. And if a bat happens to brush the top, I mean, how many different things would kind of just evoke terror in you? And I'm sure a number of these boys who are facing this ordeal rip off the blindfold and run back into the house. But those who survive the nights when the sun shines through, they take off the blindfold. I mean, they have the sense of satisfaction and everything else like that, but then they notice something else that they didn't know. And is that they look over and that, 10 yards away on a second stump is their father with a spear in his hand, ready to defend them from any enemy that would threaten their life. And I mean, as much as we're cut off from the church, we're not cut off from the Holy Spirit. We're not cut off from God. And our Father is sitting there, ready to defend us from the second death. And I think that's something that we need to cling to. We need to remember, and perhaps to embrace, is a deeper sense of the presence of God and the Holy Spirit with us in every moment. Because we used to joke around youth group about how we'd have certain people that would be someone on Saturday night, and then they'd be somebody totally different on Sunday. And for those who don't work in ministry like you and I do, that's an easier reality. I mean, it not impossible to live a double life, but a different kind of a double life, I think, when you're living and working in the world. And the question of, do we remember that God is present with us where we go? Do we remember that God stands by to defend us, to protect us, not necessarily from the things that we fear, but for the things we should be afraid of?
The real dangers, indeed. I think one of the images that I've been reflecting on these last few days is the image of warfare. Now, part of this is because I've been listening to the Iliad and the sacking of Troy by the great Greeks and the Trojans in that great war. And the fact of the matter is that we are in the midst of a great war where we are battling against an invisible enemy. We can't see this enemy. It is so microscopic, so tiny, and yet it deals mighty blows, not only to our own person, but to our society at large. The economic ramifications of this virus are going to be something that we are going to suffer with for quite some time. The world is never going to be the same after this virus. And I don't want to be overblowing that fact. I think it's just something that we need to recognize. The world is going to be different. And the thing is, in this battle, we don't have, at least ourselves, don't have the destiny to do battle against the coronavirus itself. We have the vocation and the destiny to do battle against the whole host of its allies and legions that follow in its wake. Not maybe in a sort of biological way, but in a spiritual and allegorical way. We are being called as leaders now to do battle against panic, chaos, against distress, hopelessness, the bad kind of fear, and all a host of other nasties. We are called to do battle and to hold the line and not let the people of God suffer any greater losses due to the attacks of these foes. And we are called to a vocation of heroism now. Whether, like I said, we are ready or not, here we are. And now is a time to, essentially, excuse the language, but man up. It is a time to do battle and do it fiercely. do it in the ways of Ajax, Odysseus, Diomedes, and all these great Greeks, to battle like Hector, and not to lose heart. That is the biggest thing that I think we need to remember, is to ask the Lord not to lose heart during these times, to be able to see that this enemy of ours doesn't mind race, gender, age, sex, anything at all. Everyone's threatened by it. Everyone needs our defense. I think this is a time when we are called not only just to serve our churches, our neighbors, but even the stranger, even those who are the most vulnerable that don't have anyone else to turn to. We are called to defend them and to offer the support that we can in the ways, like I said, of spiritual support, emotional support, psychological support. It's a time for hope. It's a time for battle.
If I can take that a step further, Archbishop Smith gave a homily last summer, Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, and kind of flipped a passage I've heard and used a lot on its side. You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I always sort of thought about that, the gates of hell will rattle the church a little bit, but it'll never defeat us. And Archbishop Smith said, gates are not an offensive weapon. They're a defensive weapon. And the idea that the church, when we accept our identity and our mission to go out and to do, the gates of hell don't stand a chance, but it's because we're going out we're going to do something with it. And there's a temptation in a time like this. I mean, I'm certainly, we need to keep the mandates given to us by those authorities that were under the civil ones and the church ones. But there's a temptation beyond that to just insulate yourself and barricade yourself and then cut yourself off, not just practicing medical isolation, but total isolation. Mm-hmm. And I think you talking about the vulnerable neighbors among us. Who are those who shouldn't be going into a grocery store right now? In our families, in our neighborhoods, in our parish communities. Who are those kids we know for whom school is the safe place? Because home is a difficult place to be. And how are we embracing the opportunity, again, within the limits we've been given, because there are certain limits that we need to abide by, but how are we looking out for those things? Dropping groceries on people's doorsteps, making actual phone calls, not just text messages.
That's it.
There are people who are introverts who are going to flourish over these weeks and months. And there are people who are extroverts who are going to suffer tremendously. And how are we looking out for some of those? I mean, there are numerous opportunities, mild ones and major ones, some of which are life and death beyond the virus itself. And are we embracing and hearing our call to do so, to be the warriors who do battle spiritually and pragmatically?
Indeed. It is not a time to lose heart. In fact, I think we are entering into an opportunity to become greater than we ever were. This is a forge that we have all been thrown into. Let us refine ourselves. Let us put into practice all these things that we've heard for years upon years in the churches about loving our neighbors and of doing this or that during this time of peace. It is now time for war, spiritual warfare, and time for challenge. We are put into this, like I said, whether we wanted it or not. Now, what are we going to do with it? What are the actions that we are going to be proud of in the years to come when we look back at this time in our world? How will our nobility flourish? Because I do think, even speaking maybe in regards to the priests, with the many years, in the last number of years, of the priest abuse scandal, I think it is an opportunity now, maybe not to pay back, or maybe not to pay off the debt of the bad priests, but in some ways, we are called to rise to the occasion and be the heroes that people need us to be in that way. We are called to at least right some of the wrongs by our presence, our sacrifice, and our ability to hold up morale. I'm reminded that I think the best example of this heroism that I speak of is the example of Saint Maximilian Kolbe and his martyrdom. What we are called to do is to be able to get the prisoners to sing in the tight little room, and to sing with hearts that still have hope. It's difficult, it's impossible, but with God, I think it can be done.
I think in a lot of ways it's easy to, as a member of the church, it's easy to look around and see what we've been cut off from, in the sense of not being able to come and celebrate with you, not being able to come and receive the Eucharist, not having the same direct access to many things that we did. But I think it's also got to be quite challenging to be on your side of things and to stand in front of an empty church and to say your mass privately or in your chapel, and knowing that, I imagine Sunday will be a real sobering moment for all of us.
Too much so. As I was preparing before my ordination, one of the books I read was on the spirituality of the diocesan priest, as I am a diocesan priest. And the spirituality sort of mentioned there was that it is very much tied to the Eucharist, very much tied to this sacrament of Holy Mass, very much tied to the sacrament of communion. And what does it mean when there is no visible communion around me? I know that my Redeemer and my Savior lives, and my Vindicator is here. That's never put into question. But in some ways, I'm not whole. A part of me is missing with this. And that's hard. That's difficult to bear. It's not something that I think anyone has ever thought would be possible. It is the experience of Good Friday for a much longer period of time than anyone wishes. But I think with Good Friday, the resurrection is in store.
I had a friend comment that I really didn't anticipate giving up this much for Lent.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It is the Lent of Lents at this point.
I think your Good Friday comment, I've often found myself on Good Friday, Holy Saturday particularly. Good Friday, there's lots going on, but you hit Holy Saturday, there's a beautiful reading, the Office of Readings, the silence of the day. And for us, I don't know that we can ever properly enter into the silence of the day because we know what's coming. Usually if you're involved in the church at all, you're redecorating for the Easter Vigil, you're practicing for RCIA initiations, you're blessing Easter basket. There's all the things that go on. The kids are babbling on about jelly beans and chocolate bunnies and all the things Jesus left us. And to really experience the emptiness that Holy Saturday would have been for the apostles has never been, I think, an experience any of us have been able to live. But this year, is this going to be a few weeks? Are we going to get back into our churches for Holy Week? It's sounding very, very unlikely, just from the things I'm hearing, that we're going to be back in by then when people are talking in the context of months to get through this.
Yeah.
And so we're going to sit here not knowing what and how and what things are going to be like on the other side. And the apostles must have had a sense that something was going to happen. But did they really grasp it? And that emptiness of Holy Saturday, this is a tremendous part of our experience this year. I think in a way that the last few generations have never known. I mean, I imagine if you lived in England in 1918 or in Europe in the 40s, I think you knew this emptiness. If you lived through the Depression, or if you've been, again, in other parts of the world, I think we've been very fortunate, mm-hmm. I think, in a good chunk of this part of the world, not to know that same sense of unknowingness. Although there are some of our brothers and sisters who have, from different ethnicities, those who are on the street, they've known the not knowing what's going to come next. Am I going to make it through? Are we going to make it through?
I do think it's a very collective and a great humbling experience that we've been put into. And once more, what will we do with this humility? What will we do with this experience? It is a time to choose whether we do something wise with it or whether we continue in our ways and lead into further foolishness. It's a time for decision. It's a time, it's the crux time in a sense. Time for choice.
All right, so imagine somebody's looking at this video for the first time, looking for, what do I do now? So what would you tell the average Catholic person or non-Catholic person who has stumbled onto this video, has heard what we say? What should they do?
It's a good question. Don't panic, I think, is the first thing. Don't panic. Be able to recognize the emotions that are going on in you right now, but also don't simply stay with the emotion of fear. Allow it to move you into something greater. Will you pray at this time? Not just for yourself, but for others who are in a worse situation. Will you go out, express that sense of charity for others? Will we turn to the Lord and ask Him to take this sacrifice that we are experiencing, this suffering, and turn it into a greater glory? Will we, through this fast, offer that up? It is still the time of Lent. That's not been dismissed. That's what we are to do. Hold fast to the things that we have been given. Don't break the line. Sort of talked about all this warrior-esque things, and I haven't actually mentioned anything about my cassock, which I sort of wanted to earlier on. But the reason I put this on is, once more, I think the great call that us priests have at this given moment to be even more visible than we usually are. Because in many ways, people being cut off from the church, this is their only way of seeing that we still exist and that we're still doing things. We're not shut up in our ivory towers or in our man caves, but we are still with the people. Have the rosary out here, so this is the chief weapon of choice during this time, to battle against Satan and his legions, and the despair that comes from that. The Pope has asked us today to do a special rosary, to unite each other during this time and pray for a rapid end to this plague. Let's take that seriously. This is a time not to lose hope, but to redouble our efforts in our prayer. If we were tired before, well, I'm sorry, but it's time to do more. It's a trying time, but it's also a time of great potential and great opportunity when we can rise to glory given to us by God in this opportunity.